The winter of 1836 clung to London like a ghost that refused to leave. Frost veiled the stone steps of Whitmore House, and the gas lamps flickered with a pale, watchful light. Inside, silence had become a permanent tenant. Since the death of the Duke of Whitmore, the grand residence had felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Lady Arabella Whitmore moved through its corridors as one might drift through a dream that had long outstayed its welcome. She was 27 years of age and had worn widow's black for nearly 2 years. Society spoke of her with admiration and envy in equal measure. The Duchess who never wept in public, the beauty who carried her mourning like a crown. Her composure had become her currency, her silence her shield. Yet within the stillness of her private rooms, Arabella lived with memories that refused to die. The Duke had been admired by all of London and feared by those who truly knew him. His charm was a mask, his cruelty a habit. She had learned early that a woman's survival often depended upon the grace with which she endured humiliation. Each morning began with the same ritual. She descended to the breakfast room, untouched by warmth, her every movement deliberate. The servants spoke in whispers, afraid of disturbing the fragile calm that ruled the house. Outside the frost gleamed, inside the fire burned low. The world had continued its turning, but Arabella remained fixed in the orbit of her grief, her reputation, and the heavy inheritance of a name that no longer comforted her. On this particular morning, as the city stirred beneath a pale dawn, she received a letter that would alter the course of her quiet existence. The seal was unfamiliar, the handwriting firm and precise. It was addressed simply, "To Her Grace, Lady Arabella Whitmore." Within, a single sentence waited like a spark on dry paper. "I shall call upon you at noon with matters concerning the late Duke's estate. Respectfully, Elias Rowan." The name struck her like an echo from another life. Elias Rowan. A servant's son, once a boy with dark eyes and quick hands, dismissed from the household a decade ago under shameful circumstances. She had not spoken his name aloud since the day he was cast out, accused of theft he did not commit. Her late husband had used that accusation to destroy him after the boy had dared to defend her from an insult during one of the Duke's drunken fits. Elias had disappeared from London, and she had thought never to hear of him again. Yet here he was, returning after 10 years, with authority enough to request an audience in the house where he had once polished the silver. How could that be? Had he found wealth abroad? Had he come to expose the Duke's cruelty? Or did fate intend to unearth what she had tried so hard to bury? When noon arrived, the butler announced the visitor in a tone that betrayed both confusion and awe. "Mr. Elias Rowan, Your Grace." The name hung in the air like a challenge. Arabella rose from her chair, her pulse unsteady though her face remained composed. The man who entered the drawing-room bore little resemblance to the boy she remembered. He was taller now, his shoulders broad beneath the cut of a dark coat that spoke of success rather than servitude. His hair was the color of mahogany polished by sunlight, his eyes steady, his expression grave. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head. His voice was low, controlled, yet there was something beneath it, a restrained defiance, a quiet question that had waited 10 years for an answer. She gestured for him to sit, though her own knees threatened to betray her. "Mr. Rowan," she said evenly, "I confess I did not expect to see you again." "Nor I, Your Grace," he replied. "But life has a curious habit of bringing old debts to account." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken memories. Finally, Arabella forced herself to ask, "You wrote of matters concerning the Duke's estate. What business brings you here?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "I have recently acquired several of the late Duke's outstanding debts. The Whitmore holdings in the northern counties are, by law, now under my management." She felt the ground tilt beneath her composure. "You purchased them?" "I did," he answered simply, "with coin earned honestly. I intend to see that what was taken unjustly from my family is returned. And yet, I did not come for vengeance, Your Grace. I came for truth." Arabella's breath caught. There was accusation in his words, but also restraint. He could have destroyed her reputation with a whisper of scandal. Instead, he sat before her with measured dignity, as though testing the edges of a wound long healed on the surface but raw beneath. "The truth," she repeated softly. "Some truths serve only to reopen pain, and some," Elias said quietly, "set the soul free." The fire cracked, scattering a brief shower of sparks. For a moment neither spoke. In his gaze, Arabella saw something she had not felt in years: recognition without judgment. The boy she had known had returned as a man who owed her nothing, yet still looked at her with something dangerously close to understanding. She rose, her voice barely above a whisper. "You may speak with the estate's solicitor tomorrow. For today, Mr. Rowan, I find myself unprepared for conversation." He stood as well, bowing slightly. "As you wish, Your Grace. I have waited 10 years. One more day will not trouble me." When he left, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Arabella moved to the window and watched his carriage disappear into the white fog of the street. Her reflection in the glass looked pale and unfamiliar, as if she too had returned from a place far away. She pressed her hand against the cold pane and whispered to no one, "Why now?" Outside, snow began to fall, soft and relentless. Inside, a heart that had long been dormant gave its first quiet stir of awakening. The following morning arrived shrouded in a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The servants moved about with subdued curiosity. Word had already spread through the household that a certain Mr. Elias Rowan had returned, a man once of humble position who now carried himself like a gentleman. No one dared ask questions, but glances were exchanged in the corridors, cautious and wide-eyed. In Whitmore House, gossip was currency, and silence was never absolute for long. Lady Arabella entered the breakfast room later than usual. Her movements betrayed nothing of the unrest that had followed her through a sleepless night. She had sat before her fire until dawn, turning over every memory that the name Elias Rowan had stirred. The boy who once polished the silver had grown into a man who commanded respect. The injustice done to him a decade ago had never truly left her conscience. She remembered the sound of the Duke's voice that night, sharp with fury, the accusation of theft, the strike that followed. She remembered standing silent, powerless, as the boy was dragged away. She had wanted to speak, to tell the truth, but she had already learned that her husband's wrath could destroy anyone who challenged him. She had not spoken then. The guilt had stayed. Now, the very ghost of that silence had returned in flesh and blood. As she took her tea, the butler entered with a cautious step. "Your Grace, Mr. Rowan has called again. He requests your permission to meet regarding the estate papers." She hesitated for the briefest moment, then said, "Show him to the study. I shall attend presently." Coot. When she entered the study, Elias was standing by the window, examining the heavy curtains as though the pattern of the fabric might reveal a secret. The morning light caught the faint scar along his jaw, a mark she did not remember. He turned as she entered and bowed slightly. "Your Grace." "Mr. Rowan," she replied, taking her seat at the desk. "I understand you have brought certain documents." He produced a leather folio and placed it carefully before her. "These concern the northern holdings. The Duke's debts were extensive. I have assumed them, which grants me partial authority over the estate. I would prefer to discuss how that authority might serve mutual benefit rather than conflict." She studied him. "You have changed much." "So have you," he said quietly, though not in the way one might expect. His words were simple, yet they carried a gravity that unsettled her. There was no flattery, no presumption, only truth, delivered without malice. "You seem to have prospered," she said at last. "May I ask where you built such fortune?" "In the colonies first, then in trade. Ships, textiles, steel. I learned that the world rewards persistence more than birth." He paused, his tone softening. "It also teaches patience. 10 years gives a man time to measure what matters." Arabella folded her hands, uncertain how to respond. He did not boast. He did not accuse. He merely existed in the room like a mirror she had long avoided. After a moment she said, "The management of these properties is complex. I have relied upon my steward, but he is growing ill. Perhaps it would be prudent for you to remain here for a time to oversee the transition." It was a suggestion she had not planned to make, yet as soon as the words left her lips, she understood why she had said them. There was something about his presence that disturbed her calm, and yet she did not wish him to vanish again. Elias regarded her with measured surprise. "To remain here at Whitmore House?" "Yes," she said, steadying her tone. "The estate's affairs demand clarity. You may take a guest chamber. It will be convenient." He inclined his head. "As your Grace commands." There was no irony in his voice, yet she felt the faint sting of the old order turned inside out. Once he had served her household. Now she had invited him as an equal. The house seemed to sense the inversion. The air itself shifted. That evening, Arabella passed through the hall and saw him speaking quietly with the butler. His manner was composed, respectful, but not deferential. The servants observed him with a mixture of caution and admiration. He asked for nothing, yet commanded obedience through calm certainty. It was the kind of authority that came not from title but from experience. Later, alone in her chamber, Arabella sat before her mirror. The reflection staring back was pale, but the eyes held a spark she had not seen in years. A strange unease pressed against her ribs, part fear, part curiosity. What did his return truly mean? Retribution, closure, or something neither could yet name? In the days that followed, the rhythm of the household began to alter subtly. Elias spent his mornings in the library with account books spread before him, his afternoons inspecting ledgers and riding out to meet tenants. Each evening, he reported his findings with meticulous precision. Arabella listened, noting how easily his presence filled the emptiness her late husband had left behind. The rooms that had once echoed with cold command now held quiet conversation. One evening, as she stood by the drawing-room fire, Elias entered without announcement. "Your Grace," he said, "I have completed my review. There is waste in the Northern Properties corruption among the overseers. With your permission, I will dismiss them." She nodded. "Do as you must. I trust your judgment." He hesitated before adding, "There is one more matter. The tenants speak of you with fear. They still believe the Duke lives in spirit within this house. They remember his punishments, his taxes, his cruelty." She turned sharply. "He is dead." "Yes," Elias said gently, "but his shadow is not." The words struck deeper than she wished to show. For a moment, the silence between them pulsed with memory. Then he spoke again, quieter still. "It will take time, but I mean to cleanse what his name corrupted. That is why I came back." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a servant, not a businessman, but a man who had carried pain without letting it consume him. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, respect, perhaps even forgiveness. She said softly, "You speak of redemption as if it were possible." "It is," he answered, "if one dares to try." Outside, the frost was melting. Inside, the air no longer felt quite so cold. Rain fell softly that afternoon, blurring the edges of the garden beyond the tall windows. The sound of it against the glass filled the silence between them as Arabella sat by the fire, reading a letter that had arrived from the steward of a neighboring estate. Elias stood at the far end of the room, reviewing figures from the accounts. It had become their unspoken routine to share the same space without needing to speak. The rhythm of it was almost companionable, yet there was a tension beneath the calm, as if each were aware of some fragile thread that could tighten at any moment. At length, Elias closed the ledger and set it aside. "Your Grace," he said, "the tenants at Norfield have asked for leniency. The spring floods ruined their grain. If we do not reduce their dues, they will not survive the winter." She looked up from her letter. "The Duke would have doubled their rent." "I know," he said quietly. "That is why I ask you to decide differently." Arabella hesitated. The authority she held was one of inheritance, not conviction. For years she had carried the title of Duchess like a shield, but never used it to choose mercy. Now his gaze demanded that she do so. She felt again the faint, unsettling pull he seemed to bring wherever he stood. "Grant the reduction," she said finally, "and send food from the lower stores. The house can spare it." Elias inclined his head, though his eyes softened. "They will bless you for that." "I do not want their blessings," she said. "I want peace. Peace is not given, Your Grace. It is earned." The words struck with quiet precision. She turned her face toward the fire to hide the tremor that followed. There was something about his manner, measured, honest, without flattery, that reached a part of her untouched for years. When he left the room, she remained where she was, staring into the flames until the memories began to stir again. She saw him as he had been long ago, a boy with sleeves rolled to his elbows, laughter quick and careless before the world had hardened him. She remembered the day everything changed, the Duke's fury, the accusation of theft, the bruise across the boy's cheek that she had never forgotten, and her own silence, the silence that had condemned them both. The rain continued. Hours passed unnoticed. When she finally rose, the corridor outside was dark except for the faint glow of lamps. She moved without thinking toward the old music room, drawn by a faint sound, a piano, hesitant and low. She opened the door a little and froze. Elias was seated at the instrument, his hands moving across the keys with uncertain grace. The melody was simple, one she recognized at once. It was a tune she herself had played years ago, before music had become another indulgence forbidden by her husband. He looked up when he sensed her there, but did not stop. "I remembered this," he said quietly. "You played it the night before I left. I heard it from the corridor." Her throat tightened. "I had thought you asleep." "Allô." I could not sleep, he said, his fingers still moving. The Duke had told me I would be dismissed at dawn. I listened to that song instead. It stayed with me all these years. The notes faltered, and he lowered his hands. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Arabella stepped inside and stood beside him. The piano's lid reflected their faces, pale and uncertain in the dim light. "Why did you return, Elias?" she asked. Truly, he considered before answering, because some memories do not let a man rest until they are faced. I needed to look upon this house again and see if its ghosts still ruled me. And do they? Not as they once did. He glanced up at her. But perhaps they still rule you. She drew back as if struck. You presume much. Only because I know what fear looks like, he said softly. You wear it like armor. Her breath came unsteadily. You speak boldly to a duchess. I speak honestly to the woman who once shielded me with a lie, he replied. You told the Duke the missing coins were found, though they never were. You tried to protect me. Arabella turned away. It did not help you. It helped me remember that kindness existed, even in a house built on cruelty. The confession hung in the air, heavy, yet strangely tender. She could not look at him. Instead, she walked to the window and watched the rain sliding down the glass. The world would say you should hate me, she murmured. Perhaps, he said, but hatred would have kept me in chains. I came back to be free of that. There was a long silence. The sound of the rain softened, fading into quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was low. I do not know how to live without the past, Elias. It has defined everything I am. He rose from the piano bench and came to stand a respectful distance behind her. Then perhaps it is time to let it define what you choose to become. She did not answer. The faint reflection of him stood beside her in the window, and for a moment it seemed as though the years between them had folded away. The woman and the servant's son, no longer separated by title or fear, only by the weight of what had been left unsaid. When he left her that night, she remained by the window until dawn, listening to the quiet rhythm of her heart, a sound she had almost forgotten belonged to her. The next day arrived beneath a sky heavy with grey clouds, the kind that seemed to hang close enough to touch. The air held the taste of impending rain. Inside Whitmore House, the hearths had been lit early, and the scent of burning oak drifted through the corridors. Arabella spent the morning in her private study, but her mind was not on the correspondence before her. Each line blurred, replaced by thoughts of Elias, by the sound of the melody he had played the night before. The simple tune had followed her into her sleep and returned with the dawn. By midday, she surrendered the pretense of work and walked to the library. It had become Elias's domain since his arrival, the long tables scattered with account books and estate maps. He was there now, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his coat set aside, a look of concentration across his face. The firelight touched the edge of his profile, catching the faint scar along his jaw. She hesitated at the door before speaking. "Mr. Rowan," she said softly. He looked up, surprise flickering for a moment before he rose. "Your Grace." "Do not stand on ceremony," she said. "You have been here long enough to see that this house thrives on formalities it no longer deserves." He inclined his head slightly but waited for her to continue. "I would like to understand what happened after you left," she said. 10 years is a long silence. Elias closed the ledger and rested his hands on the edge of the table. For a moment, he did not speak. Then, with quiet precision, he began. "My father and I were dismissed with nothing. The Duke accused him of disloyalty because he defended me when the theft was claimed. We left London that same night. My father never recovered from the disgrace. He was a proud man, and he believed that honor, once broken, could not be mended. He found work where he could, but the shame followed him. When he died 3 years later, it was not from illness, but from sorrow." Arabella closed her eyes. "I am so very sorry." He shook his head. "You were not the hand that struck him down, but the man who was, is buried in honor while my father lies in a pauper's grave. That imbalance has haunted me more than his death." She felt the sharp edge of guilt, cold and unrelenting. "The Duke's cruelty left more scars than I can count. I lived beneath his name and learned to breathe quietly so he would not hear my thoughts." Elias's gaze softened. "I knew. Even as a boy, I knew." Her throat tightened. "How could you?" "Because kindness survives even in silence," he said. "I saw it in you. You looked at me with pity when no one else dared. I never forgot that." "Comes the entrant." She turned from him, her fingers tracing the spine of a book on the shelf, needing the cool steadiness of touch. "It was not enough. I should have spoken." He hesitated, then said gently, "You were not free, Arabella. You were a prisoner wearing diamonds. Do not mistake survival for cowardice." The sound of her name in his voice startled her. It had been years since anyone had spoken it, without title or pretense. She turned back to him, uncertain whether to correct him or welcome it. The air between them felt altered, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. "I lived by rules I did not make," she said, "and I hated myself for obeying them." "That hatred kept you alive," he replied. "It becomes strength when one learns to direct it." His calm certainty unsettled her more than anger could have. He spoke not with the bitterness of a man wronged, but with the clarity of one who had endured and learned. "I remember your father," she said after a pause. "He was kind. The household owed more to him than the Duke ever knew. If there is any way to honor him now, tell me." Elias's expression changed, the hardness easing. "There is a parcel of land near the docks. I have been using it to house workers' families. I would like to build a school there, in his name, a place where children who have nothing might learn to read, to count, to hope. That would honor him more than any stone." Her answer came without hesitation. "Then it shall be done. Whitmore House will fund it. It is the least I can give." He regarded her in silence for a moment, then said, "You owe me nothing, Your Grace." "I owe the truth," she said firmly, "and I owe peace to the memory of those who suffered for my silence." He bowed his head slightly. "Then we are allies, at least." Something unspoken lingered in his tone, a faint warmth that she could neither name nor reject. She found herself unable to hold his gaze for long. That evening, as twilight spread its blue shadow across the house, Arabella stood at the window of her chamber and watched the first drops of rain strike the glass. The conversation had unsettled her more than she wished to admit. The ghosts of her marriage had followed her for too many years, and now Elias's presence was drawing them out one by one, demanding they be seen for what they were. She had thought herself numb to pain, but she was learning that numbness was only pain that had learned to wait. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the housekeeper, a woman of steady voice and loyal heart. "Your Grace, Mr. Rowan has gone out. He asked that I tell you he will return after visiting the tenants near the southern fields." Arabella nodded, though she did not ask why he would go at this hour. When the door closed again, she looked out toward the faint glow of lamps along the distant road. Somewhere out there, Elias rode through the mist, carrying both the past and the fragile beginnings of something that neither of them yet understood. She drew the curtains and turned away from the window. For the first time in years, she found herself whispering a prayer not for forgiveness, but for courage to face whatever waited in the light of the coming day. Spring arrived quietly, as though uncertain whether it would be welcomed. The frost that had haunted the gardens melted into small rivers that ran along the stone paths, and pale blossoms began to appear among the hedges. Whitmore House, long accustomed to the stillness of morning, seemed to breathe again. Curtains were drawn open in rooms that had remained closed for years, and the servants, sensing a shift in the air, moved with something close to hope. Elias had remained at the estate, overseeing the repairs and reorganization of the northern properties. His presence had altered the rhythm of the household without intention. He rose early, often before dawn, and rode out to the fields to speak with tenants himself. When he returned, his boots carried the mud of real work, not the polished dust of ceremony. The servants respected him. They obeyed not from duty but from trust. Arabella began to see him each day, though rarely in any formal sense. They would cross paths in the library, at breakfast, or in the courtyard where he inspected the repairs to the carriage house. At first, their conversations were brief and practical, touching only on matters of estate management. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly, the words between them began to lengthen. A question became a discussion turned to shared reflection, and soon their silences grew companionable. One morning, she found him in the garden, speaking quietly to one of the young gardeners about the rose beds. The boy nodded as Elias demonstrated how to prune the branches to encourage new blooms. Arabella watched from a short distance, unnoticed. There was gentleness in his movements, a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of the man who had once ruled this place. The Duke had broken beauty out of pride. Elias cultivated it out of respect. When he turned and saw her, he smiled slightly, not with deference, but with a kind of calm familiarity. "Your Grace," he said, "the roses have survived the frost better than expected. It seems resilience runs deep in this soil." "Resilience," she repeated, approaching slowly. "It is a word that sounds better than it feels." "It often is," he said, "but it keeps the world from collapsing." They walked together along the garden path. She noticed for the first time how his hands, roughened by work, carried a quiet strength, and how his voice, though measured, held a warmth that reached beyond politeness. "Do you ever tire of duty, Mr. Rowan?" she asked. "Every man does," he replied. "But it is what one does after the weariness that defines him. Some surrender to it, others endure." "And you?" she asked. He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "I endure." The answer lingered between them. They reached the far end of the garden, where a small fountain stood, long disused. Elias studied it for a moment. "This could be restored," he said. "Water should not remain still. It becomes stagnant." She glanced at him, hearing something beyond his words. "Then let it run again," she said softly. In the days that followed, she found herself seeking his company without quite meaning to. When he was absent, the rooms felt emptier. When he entered, the silence felt less heavy. He never presumed upon her attention, yet she sensed that he too noticed the change. It was not spoken of, but it existed, delicate and undeniable. One evening after dinner, Arabella sat at the piano. The same melody he had played weeks earlier drifted through the room. She played it slowly, each note deliberate. When she reached the final chord, she realized Elias was standing in the doorway. He had been listening. "You remember it better than I did," he said. "It never truly left me," she replied. "Some memories are loyal even when we do not wish them to be." He stepped closer, the lamplight tracing the line of his face. "Then perhaps not all loyalty is a curse." She looked up at him, and for a moment the formality between them slipped away. The silence that followed was not empty but full, like the pause before a confession that neither dared to make. Then, with quiet restraint, he said, "Your Grace, I will be traveling north in 2 days to inspect the properties. I shall return within a fortnight." Her heart faltered at the thought, though she hid it behind composure. "A fortnight," she repeated. "The tenants will be fortunate to have your attention." "I will leave the reports with your steward," he said, then hesitated. "Is there anything you wish me to see to personally?" She wanted to say no, but instead she said, "Return safely, Kodal." He bowed his head slightly. "That I will do." When he was gone, the house felt larger than before. The echo of his voice lingered in the hallways. Arabella told herself that it was habit, nothing more, that she had merely grown accustomed to the rhythm of his presence. Yet the days that followed proved her wrong. The meals seemed longer, the air colder. She caught herself pausing by the window each morning, searching the road as though expecting to see him ride through the mist. On the 12th day, a letter arrived. It bore his handwriting, steady, precise, unmistakable. He wrote of the tenants, the repairs, the improvements he intended to complete, and at the end, one line that she read again and again: "The north is harsh, yet I find myself missing the quiet of Whitmore House. Perhaps I have grown used to its peace." She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, startled by the depth of relief it brought. When he returned, the weather had turned warm. The fountain he had restored now ran clear, the water catching the evening light. Arabella met him in the garden, her composure calm but her voice softer than before. "You kept your promise," she said. "I told you I would." The fountain's gentle sound filled the pause between them. She could not name what stirred in her chest, hope perhaps, or something gentler still. Whatever it was, it had begun to take root, quiet but sure, beneath the surface of words not yet spoken. Summer crept upon London like a secret whispered too often. The city's air grew heavy, thick with the scent of flowers and dust. Whitmore House, once isolated from the noise of the season, began to draw attention it had not sought. The reason for that attention was simple enough. People had begun to talk. It started with small observations passed quietly at afternoon teas. The widowed Duchess of Whitmore, once so withdrawn, now received a frequent visitor. The same gentleman was seen walking beside her through the gardens, speaking in low tones, his manner too familiar to be strictly proper. At first the whispers were confined to drawing rooms, then they reached the clubs and parlours of Mayfair, where gossip was an art and reputations could rise or fall on the weight of a rumour. Arabella had been aware of the murmurs long before anyone dared to speak of them in her presence. It was in the way her maid hesitated before drawing the curtains, the way acquaintances' letters arrived with polite concern disguised as curiosity. Yet she chose to ignore it. She told herself that words could not touch what was still unspoken between her and Elias. But words, once loosed, have a way of finding their mark. One morning, as she sat in the library, a letter arrived from Lady Somerton, an old acquaintance of her late husband. It was written in the precise hand of a woman who delighted in control. "My dear Lady Whitmore," it began, "London adores a story, and yours has become quite the subject. It is said that a certain gentleman of trade has taken up residence at your estate. I am sure such talk is unkind, yet you must know how such things appear. A widow of your standing must take care to preserve her dignity." The words pricked like thorns. Arabella folded the letter and placed it aside. Dignity, she thought, was a veil society granted only to those who obeyed its rules. For years she had worn that veil faithfully, and it had given her nothing but solitude. That afternoon, Elias returned from inspecting the stables to find her standing by the window, the letter still on the table beside her. He sensed the tension at once. "Has something happened?" he asked. She turned toward him with a composure too perfect to be natural. "It seems our household has become a source of amusement for others." He frowned. "Gossip?" She gave a small, brittle smile. "Nothing less. A widowed duchess and a man of business under the same roof, it was only a matter of time." He studied her for a long moment. "Do you wish me to leave?" The question startled her more than the gossip itself. "No," she said quickly, then softened her tone. "That is, I see no reason you should." His gaze remained steady. "If my presence causes harm to your reputation, I will go." "Do you think I care for what they say?" she asked, the edge of her voice betraying more than defiance. "They have spoken of me for years, first as the perfect wife, then as the perfect widow. Perhaps it is time they spoke of something closer to truth." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them was charged, like the moment before a storm. Then Elias said quietly, "You have more courage than any woman I have known." Quote, "Courage," she murmured, "or exhaustion." The faintest smile touched his lips. Sometimes they are the same. In the days that followed, the rumors grew bolder. Invitations once frequent became rare. A few long-time acquaintances visited out of courtesy but left with polite haste. Arabella bore it with calm indifference. Yet inside she felt the familiar sting of isolation. The difference was that now she was not entirely alone. One evening, as the light faded, Elias found her in the garden. The fountain murmured softly, and the air smelled of roses. She stood beside it, gazing into the rippling water, as though seeking something lost. "They have turned their backs," she said quietly, "but I do not miss them." "You never needed them," he replied. "I thought I did," she said. "I built my life upon their approval. It was all I was taught to value." Quote, "And now?" "Now," she said after a pause, "I am learning what value means." He stepped closer but did not reach for her. "If I have caused you trouble, say the word and I will end it." She turned to face him. "You have caused me to live again. Do not apologize for that." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For a heartbeat, silence stretched. Then he said softly, "There are those who will never forgive a woman for wanting life." "And men?" she asked. "They are forgiven for everything," he said. She let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though it trembled. "Then let us give them something else to forgive." He smiled faintly but did not answer. The night had deepened around them. Somewhere beyond the walls the city hummed with its endless chatter, but here, beneath the soft spill of moonlight, the world felt far away. The sound of the fountain was the only witness to what neither dared to name. Later, in the solitude of her room, Arabella sat at her writing desk. She opened a fresh sheet of paper and began a letter to no one in particular. They say reputation is a mirror held by others. But what if one no longer wishes to see oneself through borrowed eyes? She set down her pen and stared at the words. Then, with deliberate care, she folded the page and placed it in the drawer. Some confessions were not meant for ink. That night, sleep came late. She dreamt of her old life of voices that commanded and silenced, of corridors that echoed with fear. And then she dreamt of the garden, of the sound of water, and the warmth of a gaze that held no judgment. When she woke, the first light of dawn was touching the curtains. For the first time in years, she rose without dread. The days that followed were bright but restless. Sunshine poured through the tall windows of Whitmore House, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. It should have felt peaceful, yet to Arabella it felt like the hush before a storm. The gossip had not faded. It had only changed its shape, becoming quieter but more poisonous. A few of her oldest acquaintances had ceased calling entirely. Even her housekeeper began to receive letters from other households, discreetly inquiring whether certain rumors might be true. Elias noticed the tension, though she tried to hide it. He had grown more withdrawn, speaking little at meals, spending longer hours outdoors inspecting the properties. When he did speak, there was a restraint in his voice, as if each word had been weighed before being allowed to leave his lips. Arabella felt the distance widening between them, and though she told herself it was better this way, the quiet hurt more than any accusation. One evening, as the sun sank low and the air shimmered with the last warmth of the day, Elias came to her in the drawing room. He did not sit. His hat was still in his hand, and his expression was composed, almost formal. "Your Grace," he began, "I have received an invitation to travel north again. There is work there that demands my attention. I intend to leave tomorrow." She set down her teacup, though her hand trembled slightly. "Tomorrow?" she repeated. "You said nothing of this before." "Auzette, I did not wish to trouble you until I was certain. Is it business that takes you away?" she asked softly. "Or reputation?" His eyes met hers, steady but unreadable. "Both, perhaps. I will not be the cause of your isolation. London forgets easily, but only if it is not reminded." Her voice dropped. "You think distance will make them forget me?" "I think distance may protect you." "And who will protect me from the silence that follows?" she asked. The words escaped before she could temper them. He took a slow breath. "Silence, Your Grace, may be the only safety left to you." The title stung more than she expected. It had been weeks since he had used it so deliberately. She rose from her chair and walked to the window. The evening light gilded her figure, casting her reflection against the glass. "You speak as if I am made of porcelain," she said, "as if one unkind word will shatter me." Quote, "I speak as one who knows what cruelty can do," he replied. She turned sharply. "And do you think I do not?" The question hung between them, fierce and trembling. Elias took a step forward, then stopped. "That is not what I meant." "Then what do you mean?" she demanded, her composure slipping. "That I must live behind these walls forever? That my life must remain a performance for the approval of strangers? You speak of protection, but what you offer feels too much like another cage." "Ode." Her words struck him like a blow. For a moment he said nothing. Then, very quietly, he answered, "I have built cages before, without meaning to. I will not build another around you." He set his hat on the table. "When I first came here, I meant only to settle the debts of my father's name. I did not imagine that peace would become harder to find than justice. You have given me more than you know, but if staying here brings you harm, then I must go." "Croft." She looked at him, and the ache in her chest deepened. "You speak of leaving, as if it were an act of kindness." "It is," he said, "perhaps the only one left to me." Her eyes glistened, but she did not allow the tears to fall. "And what of me, Elias? What kindness is left for me when you are gone?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he crossed the room and stopped before her. "You will have your freedom," he said softly. "Freedom from what?" she whispered. "From loneliness? From hope?" For the first time, his composure faltered. He reached for her hand, then hesitated, his fingers hovering just above hers. The air between them felt alive, fragile, trembling with all the things they had not said. Finally, he let his hand fall. "I cannot give you peace," he said, "only my absence." And with that, he turned and left the room. The door closed gently behind him, but the sound seemed to echo through the house like a final chord. Arabella remained standing where he had left her, the warmth of the setting sun fading from the window pane. The room, once a refuge, felt suddenly vast and hollow. That night, she did not sleep. She walked through the darkened halls of Whitmore House, her footsteps soundless on the carpet. Every shadow seemed to carry the memory of his presence. The library where he had worked, the garden path where they had walked together, the fountain whose water now murmured like a distant echo of his voice. When dawn came, she found herself in the garden. The first light caught the dew on the roses, turning them to glass. She stood beside the fountain and whispered to the morning air, "Do not go." But the answer, when it came, was only silence. By afternoon, the carriage was ready. She watched from the window as he spoke with the coachman, as he turned once toward the house before stepping inside. The wheels began to move, crunching over the gravel. Arabella gripped the windowsill until her knuckles whitened. A part of her wished she could run after him, call him back, break every rule she had ever obeyed. But another part of her, older, warier, knew that some distances cannot be closed by will alone. When the carriage disappeared beyond the gate, she felt the weight of the house settle around her once more. The silence returned, vast and familiar, but it no longer felt safe. It felt like exile. The weeks that followed Elias's departure unfolded in silence so complete that even the ticking of the long clock in the hall seemed intrusive. Whitmore House returned to the rhythm it had known before his arrival, quiet, proper, suffocating. Yet for Arabella, the silence no longer offered comfort. It pressed against her like the air before a storm. Letters continued to arrive, full of polite concern disguised as scrutiny. Invitations, once plentiful, had dwindled to none. The city that had once admired her now regarded her with curiosity, waiting to see whether the widow of Whitmore would retreat into mourning once again, or attempt to defy her prescribed fate. For a time she withdrew entirely. The days passed in measured stillness, and the nights brought little rest. Every corner of the house reminded her of him, the faint scent of tobacco in the library, the garden where the fountain still ran, the room where they had last spoken. Then, one morning, a card arrived bearing the crest of Lady Somerton. It announced a gathering, a charity dinner to raise funds for the orphanage the late Duke had once sponsored. The irony was bitter, but Arabella understood the message. Attendance was not a choice, it was a summons. If she refused, it would confirm the whispers. If she went, she would face them all. When the evening arrived, London was bathed in golden light. The streets gleamed from a recent rain, and the carriages lined the entrance of the Somerton townhouse like dark jewels. Arabella stepped from her own carriage with her chin lifted, her gown of grey silk understated but perfect. Every eye turned toward her. Conversations faltered. She moved through the crowd with calm grace, acknowledging greetings that were too sweet to be sincere. Lady Whitmore, Lady Somerton cooed, approaching with the precision of a hawk. "How lovely to see you. It has been too long." "Indeed," Arabella replied, her voice smooth. "Time has a way of revealing who one truly misses." A faint smile touched the other woman's painted lips. "You have been keeping to yourself, I hear. One must be careful, my dear, or people will invent reasons for solitude." Arabella met her gaze evenly. "Let them invent. It saves me the effort of explaining." A murmur rippled through the surrounding guests. Lady Somerton blinked, surprised, but recovered quickly. "Ah, you have grown bold in your widowhood." "Not bold," Arabella said, "merely tired of pretending that silence equals virtue." The words fell into the glittering air like stones into still water. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Somerton laughed, brittle and insincere, and the room resumed its low hum of conversation. But the damage or the freedom had been done. Arabella felt it in the way people's eyes followed her now, no longer with pity but with something closer to fascination. Throughout the dinner, she endured the veiled remarks and cautious politeness of those who circled her. Every comment was a test, every smile a question. She answered them all with the serenity of someone who no longer feared losing what society had already taken. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts returned again and again to Elias. What would he say if he could see her now, standing in this room filled with masks and whispers? Would he recognize the woman she was becoming, or had he already left her behind in the memory of what they had shared? When the meal ended, the host rose to make a speech about charity and duty. His words were full of polite benevolence and empty promises. Arabella listened only halfway until she heard her own name. "And we must acknowledge the presence of Lady Whitmore," he declared. "A paragon of grace, whose generosity has long supported this cause. Her late husband's legacy remains a beacon of—" She rose before he could finish. "Forgive me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "but I must correct you. The legacy you speak of was not benevolence. It was debt and cruelty. The man you praise built his reputation upon the suffering of others. If you wish to honor the truth, then speak it plainly." The silence that followed was absolute. Faces turned, mouths parted, eyes wide with disbelief. Lady Somerton's fan slipped from her fingers. Arabella stood calm and unflinching beneath their gaze. "I will continue to support those in need," she said, "but not in his name. In my own." Quote. And then she walked out, each step measured, each breath steady. The night air met her like a benediction. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her husband's name lift from her shoulders. It was not freedom won through forgiveness or indulgence. It was freedom earned through truth. The following morning, newspapers across London carried mention of the scene. "Lady Whitmore challenges the memory of her late husband," one headline read. Another called her the Duchess who dared to speak. Some condemned her, others admired her, but all spoke of her. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had become her shield. That evening, she sat in the garden, the fountain murmuring softly beside her. The roses were in full bloom, their scent rich in the warm air. She thought of Elias, of his calm, his steadiness, the quiet strength that had taught her how to stand. She wondered whether news of her defiance would reach him, and what he would think when it did. As the sun sank behind the trees, she whispered to the dusk, "I am not afraid." It was not a declaration for anyone to hear, but the words felt real, solid, and hers alone. For the first time, the silence around her no longer felt like exile. It felt like power. 3 weeks passed before word reached Elias in the north. He was in his office, surrounded by ledgers and reports, when a newspaper from London was placed before him. The headline caught his eye at once: "The Duchess Who Dared to Speak." Beneath it, the article recounted the details of the Somerton dinner, the widow's defiance, her rejection of her husband's legacy, her calm withdrawal from the hall. He read the words twice, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he set the paper aside. His steward, a quiet man who had worked with him for years, said gently, "It seems Lady Whitmore has given society something to talk about." Elias's gaze drifted toward the window, where rain streaked the glass. "She always had courage," he said softly. "She simply needed a reason to use it." That night, sleep did not come easily. He thought of her voice, her eyes, the way she had looked the last time they spoke, strong and wounded in equal measure. He had left her to protect her, believing that distance would save her reputation. But now, it seemed, she had chosen truth over protection. The thought filled him with pride and unease alike. By morning, his decision was made. The next day, without announcement, he left for London. The journey took 2 days. When the carriage turned into the familiar road that led to Whitmore House, the sight of its tall windows and ivy-covered walls stirred something deep within him. It no longer looked like a house of ghosts. Light glowed in several rooms, and the garden beyond the gate was alive with colour. The butler, startled but composed, received him at the door. "Mr. Rowan," he said, "Her Grace is in the garden." Elias walked through the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly. The air carried the scent of roses and summer rain. When he stepped outside, he saw her standing beside the fountain, dressed in pale blue, her hair unbound from its usual restraint. She turned at the sound of his approach, and for a moment neither spoke. "I read of you in every paper from here to Manchester," he said finally. "It seems you have managed to startle London." Arabella smiled faintly. "Then London has learned that widows can still speak." He moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "You faced them alone." "I was alone long before that night," she said quietly. "But I am not the same woman you left." "I can see that, Kodu." She looked down at the rippling water of the fountain. "They call me scandalous now. It is strange how the same voice that once praised me for obedience now condemns me for honesty. They fear what they cannot control," he said. "Do you?" Her question caught him off guard. "No," he said after a pause. "I do not fear you. I fear only that I may have lost the right to stand beside you. You left to protect me," she said. "And yet, in your absence, I discovered I no longer needed protection." His voice softened. "Then you have found what I always hoped you would yourself." She met his gaze steadily. "And what have you found?" He hesitated, then spoke with quiet honesty. "Regret. That I thought distance could silence what was never meant to be silenced. I told myself I left for your sake, but it was cowardice, Arabella. I feared what would happen if I stayed." "And what would have happened?" she asked. "I would have loved you," he said simply. The words fell between them like a confession to the wind. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very softly, "You think you have not already?" He stepped closer, his breath unsteady. "Do not mistake guilt for affection." "I do not," she said. "But I know the difference between pity and love, and you never pitied me." The air grew still. Even the fountain seemed to hush its murmuring. Elias reached out, not in haste, but with the certainty of one who has waited too long. His hand brushed hers, and she did not draw away. "I came back because I read your words," he said, "because I realized that courage without someone to witness it can feel like loneliness. You gave me purpose once. Let me return the gift." Her voice trembled, though her eyes were steady. "If you stay, it will not be easy. They will not forgive what we are." "They never have," he said, "but I no longer ask their forgiveness." She let out a breath that was half a sigh, half a laugh. "You sound very sure." "I am sure of one thing," he said, his voice low, "that I would rather stand beside you in scandal than live apart in peace." She looked at him for a long moment, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Then stay, Elias, not as a protector, not as a savior, but as my equal." His answer came without hesitation. "Always." Einsing. The sun dipped lower, casting gold across the garden. For the first time, they stood together without pretense, without distance. The world beyond the gate still whispered, but the whispers no longer mattered. Later that evening, as they sat in the library, the firelight flickering across their faces, Arabella spoke quietly. "When you left, I thought you took all the warmth from this house, but perhaps it was only waiting for your return. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the light. I do not bring warmth, he said. You created it. I only learned how to feel it. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. Then we have both learned something, at last. Outside, the night settled over the garden, calm and bright. The fountain continued to sing, its voice no longer mournful but alive. Within the house, two people sat in silence, and for once, silence meant peace. Autumn arrived early that year. The leaves along the garden paths turned gold and scarlet, falling in soft spirals that whispered across the stone. Whitmore House no longer felt haunted, but alive. The servants spoke with ease again, laughter echoing faintly through the hallways. Elias and Arabella had found a rhythm, one built on trust rather than custom, on quiet understanding rather than obligation. The city, however, had not forgotten them. Whispers still drifted through the parlours of Mayfair, but now they were tinged less with scorn than with fascination. Some admired Arabella's defiance, others waited for her to fall. She ignored them all. Her work with the estates continued. Elias handled the management, and she began directing funds to the school they had planned in her father's memory. It was on a grey afternoon in early October when the peace they had built began to crack. Arabella had just finished dictating a letter when the butler entered, pale and uneasy. "Your Grace," he said, "there is a gentleman who insists upon seeing you. He would not give his name, but he claims you will know him." Before she could answer, the door to the drawing-room opened. The man who stepped inside was older, thinner, but his presence carried the arrogance of someone who had once held power without question. Lord Pembroke, her father, Arabella Frozzi. She had not seen him in over a decade. His hair had thinned to silver, his clothes finely cut but worn at the edges. His eyes, a cold grey, still held the calculating gleam she remembered from childhood. "Arabella," he said smoothly, as though greeting her after a short absence. "My dear child, you look remarkably well." She stood slowly. "You have no right to be here," he smiled, thin and humourless. "A father always has rights." "Kamzejan, not one who sold his daughter." Elias's voice cut in from behind her. He had entered silently, drawn by the raised voices. His tone was quiet but edged with steel. Lord Pembroke turned, his expression tightening. "And who is this? The servant boy I once dismissed. I see you have made yourself quite at home." "I am Elias Rowan," he said evenly, "and I no longer answer to you." Arabella moved between them. "Why have you come, father?" Pembroke regarded her with mock surprise. "To see my daughter, naturally, and to remind her of her duties. The Whitmore estates were founded upon honour, and it seems that honour is in short supply. London whispers, my dear. You have forgotten what it means to bear a name of worth." "I have learned," she said coldly. "That worth is not a name. It is what one does with it." He chuckled. Fine words for a woman who disgraced her late husband and now lives under the roof of a tradesman. Quote. Elias took a step forward, but Arabella's hand on his arm stopped him. "Do not waste breath on him," she murmured. Pembroke's gaze sharpened. "Ah, so the rumours are true. You think yourself free now, do you? But I hold papers that say otherwise. The debts left by your husband were tied to your dowry. The estates you claim technically mine to reclaim." Arabella's breath caught. "You lie." He withdrew a folded document from his coat pocket and laid it upon the table. "The law is rarely kind to sentiment. I will require access to the funds you now control. Refuse, and I shall see your name dragged through every court and paper in London. They will call you worse than scandalous. They will call you ruined." Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly quiet. "You have lived off others all your life. You will not live off her." Lord Pembroke's lip curled. "And you will stop me? What power do you think you hold, boy?" "The power of truth," Elias said. "You forget that I know your dealings, the forged accounts, the bribes, the tenants left destitute while you drank away their wages. If you bring her name before the courts, I will bring yours before Parliament." For the first time, colour drained from the older man's face. "You dare?" Elias's tone did not rise. "I do, and I will. The question is whether you prefer exile in silence or disgrace in chains." Lord Pembroke turned to his daughter, seeking weakness. "You will not allow him to threaten me, Arabella. You are my blood." "I was your property," she said. "Now I am my own." The quiet that followed was sharper than shouting. Outside, the wind rose, scattering leaves against the windows. Lord Pembroke's expression twisted, first with disbelief, then rage. "You ungrateful girl," he hissed. "You shame your family, your title. I have no family but the one I choose, she interrupted, and no title worth keeping if it means bending to men like you. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned toward Elias. You think you have won, but you have only destroyed her. Society will not forgive this. Elias met his gaze without flinching. Then let it be destroyed too. Lord Pembroke's eyes flickered, uncertain whether to stay or retreat. At last he snatched the document from the table and strode from the room. The butler closed the door behind him, and silence settled once more. Arabella stood still, her breath trembling. Elias moved toward her, his voice gentle now. He cannot harm you. His threats have no teeth left. She looked up at him. You risked everything. I risked nothing worth keeping if it meant losing you. For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of the confrontation lingered between them, heavy but cleansing. Then she said softly, I thought I was strong, Elias, but today I realized I am only strong when you are near. He shook his head. You have always been strong. I am only the witness. Her eyes shone. Then stay and witness what comes next. I will, he said simply. That evening, as the storm broke outside, thunder rolled through the sky and rain swept against the windows. Inside, Arabella stood beside Elias by the fire. The shadows danced around them, and for the first time, the walls of Whitmore House seemed to hold warmth rather than memory. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. Never, he said. To protect what we are is worth whatever world we lose. She reached for his hand, then let the world go. Outside, lightning flared, illuminating their faces for a brief instant, two souls who had faced the storm and no longer feared its light. Winter came softly that year, without the cruel edge it once carried. By the time the first snow touched London, Whitmore House stood quiet, its great windows dark. Arabella and Elias had left the city weeks earlier, choosing not to announce their departure. There were no farewells, no explanations, only a letter to the household and another to the solicitor, ensuring the estate's business would continue in trusted hands. Their journey led them south, away from the fog and whispers toward the coast. The sea greeted them like an old song, vast, patient, and endless. The house they settled in stood on a cliff overlooking the harbour, a modest stone dwelling that belonged once to a shipmaster long gone. It had none of the splendour of Whitmore House, but its windows opened to sunlight and wind, and that was enough. The villagers spoke of them with curiosity at first. They called her the lady with the London voice, and him the gentleman who fixes everything. But soon curiosity turned to affection. They saw Arabella walking among them in simple dresses, speaking kindly to children, helping the women mend nets and sew sails. They saw Elias at the docks, lending his strength to the fishermen, teaching their sons to read and reckon numbers. It did not take long for the gossip to fade into quiet respect. Their days found rhythm quickly. In the mornings, they rose early to watch the light climb across the waves. Elias would work at his desk or with the villagers, while Arabella spent her hours at the small school they had built from an old chapel. She taught reading and writing to the children of sailors and widows, and though her hands grew ink-stained and her back ached by afternoon, she had never felt so alive. Sometimes, when the day ended, they walked together along the shore. The sea's breath filled the air with salt and promise. They spoke little on those walks. Words were no longer needed to confirm what silence already held. The world they had known had receded like the tide, leaving behind only what mattered, the steady companionship of two lives rebuilt from ruin. One evening, as they watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, Arabella said quietly, "Do you ever think of London?" "Sometimes," Elias replied, "but not with longing. That world was built on glass. It could never bear the weight of truth." She smiled faintly. "And yet it shaped us." "It did," he said, "but so does the sea. So does each morning we rise and choose peace." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "You make peace sound simple." "It is never simple," he said, "only earned." They stood together until the colors faded, the sound of the waves their only witness. As months passed, the small school flourished. Children came from neighboring villages, and word spread of the lady who taught letters and kindness in equal measure. Arabella began to write again essays, letters, reflections on what it meant to live free of fear. Some found their way back to London newspapers, unsigned, yet widely read. Her words carried quiet strength, urging compassion, humility, and reform. No one suspected the author was the scandalous Duchess who had once defied them. Elias, meanwhile, found joy in labor. He repaired boats, built a library for the village, and wrote to old business partners who still trusted his integrity. The money they earned sustained their work, but neither cared much for comfort. They lived simply, content in what they had built. One stormy night, the wind rattled the windows, and the sea roared like an ancient creature. Arabella sat by the fire, her book forgotten on her lap. Elias entered, carrying a lantern. "The fishermen are safe," he said. "Their boats made it in before the tide." She nodded, relief softening her features. "I still fear for them when the sea grows wild." "It is their life," he said. "But even storms end." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening. "Do they always?" He set down the lantern and knelt beside her chair. "Yes," he said, taking her hand. "Because there is always someone who endures them. You taught me that." She smiled through tears she did not try to hide. "And you taught me that endurance can be love." He brushed his thumb across her hand, his voice low. "Then we have both learned what matters most." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the sea continued its rhythm, fierce and eternal, but within the small house, all was calm. When morning came, the storm had passed. The air smelled clean, the waves gentle again. Arabella opened the window, letting in the cold light. The world beyond shimmered, as if reborn. She turned to find Elias already awake, writing at his desk. He looked up and smiled. "You are awake early," he said. "I dreamed of the fountain," she said. "The one at Whitmore House. It was still running." He rose and came to her side. "Then it means life continues, even in places we leave behind." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Then let it run forever." And together they stood, watching the morning unfold, the sea stretching wide before them, endless, unjudging and free. Years passed gently along the coast. The rhythm of the tides became the rhythm of their lives. Time no longer felt like an enemy but a companion, marking the days with small, precious details. The laughter of children in the schoolyard, the creak of old boats returning to harbour, the sound of Elias's steady voice reading aloud by the fire, while rain whispered against the windows. The villagers no longer saw them as outsiders. To the younger ones, they were simply Mr. and Mrs. Rowan, the couple who helped mend sails, who brought books from the city, who treated everyone with the same quiet respect. To the older folk, they were something softer still, a story to be told beside hearths on winter nights, proof that kindness could outlast scandal and that love could outgrow its chains. One spring morning, Arabella stood by the window watching the first light touch the sea. Her hair, streaked now with silver, caught the dawn and shimmered faintly. Elias entered the room behind her, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her and looked out at the horizon. "Another calm day," he said. "They have all been calm since you came back," she replied. He smiled. "Then may the sea never grow restless again." They sat together in companionable silence, the kind that needed no words. After a while, Arabella rose and walked outside. The garden they had planted years before had grown wild with roses and lavender. The air was sweet with them. Beyond the path, the small school stood quiet, its door painted a cheerful blue. From within came the faint hum of children reciting their lessons under the guidance of a young woman whom Arabella had once taught herself. Elias joined her, his hands in his coat pockets. "You have built something that will last," he said. "We built it," she corrected. "You gave it roots. I gave it wings." He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Then it will fly farther than either of us imagined." As they walked toward the cliff, the wind lifted the scent of the sea. The water stretched endlessly, a silver sheet beneath the pale sky. Arabella paused at the edge, the same place where they had stood when they first arrived. "Do you ever miss what we left behind?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "No. The world we left behind taught us everything except how to live. Here, we learned the rest." She took his hand. "I sometimes think of the girl I once was afraid, obedient, certain that her life belonged to others. I wish I could tell her what I know now." "And what is that?" he asked. "That love is not given by permission," she said softly. "It is built by choice." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Then you chose well." She smiled. "We both did." Coat. They lingered there as the morning light deepened, the sound of waves below merging with the distant laughter of children. The world seemed vast and kind in that moment, as though time itself had paused to listen. Later that evening, they sat before the fire as they often did. Elias read from a worn book of poetry, his voice calm and low. Arabella closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of his words wash over her. When he finished, she said quietly, "Do you ever think of how far we have come?" "Every day," he replied, "but distance does not measure it. It is the courage we found that tells the story." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. Then tell me again. He smiled. Once there was a woman who thought herself bound forever, and a man who thought himself unworthy of love. But the world, for all its cruelty, is still capable of mercy. It allowed them to find each other. Oh, cruel. And what did they do then? She asked. They began again, he said, and they kept beginning every day after. The firelight flickered over their faces, warm and soft. Outside, the sea murmured its endless lullaby. The stars gathered above the dark water, bright and watchful. Arabella rested her head against his shoulder. If this is what it means to begin, she whispered, then I hope it never ends. He drew her closer. It will not, he said, not while we remember who we became. Quote, and so they sat, surrounded by the quiet life they had built, two souls who had once been divided by class and fear, now bound by a love shaped through choice, respect, and endurance. Far below, the tide rolled in, smooth and steady, touching the rocks before retreating again. The sea had its rhythm, as did love, an endless returning, a promise renewed. Arabella closed her eyes, and the sound of the waves became the sound of peace. She thought of the fountain at Whitmore House, the one that had once marked her loneliness. In her mind, she saw it still running, its water clear, untiring, alive. It would always run, she knew, because some things, once awakened, never truly end.